Hi, and welcome to our video essay related to our thesis, that is, how did the US become the world's biggest power because of three areas? First World War, the Great Depression, and the Jazz Boom? Stay here and we will explain you this historical moment that changed all people's lives. First World War, from 1914 to 1918. 4 bloody years where millions of people died and the most part of Europe was destroyed. And however, the winner was United States? 19 months was the time when United States participated in the Great War. They just fight in the summer of 1918 when Europeans destroyed each other in the battlefield. And obviously, USA was the winner of this war because they were the strongest country in comparison with the rest of the fighters. How this passed? How did the United States become the world's biggest power because of its war? It is easy to understand if we take a look at the US opinion of the war in that era. They pretended not to be in any side in this war and to have a neutral position in all of this conflict. They thought that it was not their country and why to care about the war on the other side of their territory? But if the countries involved in the war wanted to ask for some money to the USA, Uncle Sam would be willing to offer the best guns and resources to incredible prices with no interests. It was a big deal for them. Any similarity with actual times is not a coincidence. It was on the Great War when the US started their war industry. Woodrow Wilson, the US president in war times, always said that his country was not at any side of the war. But the truth was that the American banks created bonds and credits to help England, France, and the European allies for the agreements and deals between the US and these countries in terms of money and financial stuff. That's how the country hid their support to the allies in the war. Whenever the enemies of the allies asked for the money that the Americans gave to the European countries, they said that it was a deal with private banks and England out of the business of the US. While countries in Europe broke their economies, the US companies won a lot of money by making war resources like carbon and steel and guns. Many guns. Okay, a lot of guns. But here is when the US started to think in participating in the war. Obviously, if countries like England or France lost the war, there will be nobody who paid the US for the resources and money they gave. It was like a "fuck you America" by the enemies of the US, because it was the end of dirty business, and that neutrality was not truth at all. The aliens had to win at any cost. The US started to send people to the war, and in 1917, the US agreed to be part of the war and to defeat the enemies of their alliance, and their war industry increased more and more. They created their own powerful army by controlling the industry, the transport, and jobs of their money, and they were focused on creating war resources like guns, boats, steel, and more. They created the military service to recruit young people to their army, people that had no idea what a war was. Finally, they knew that the support of Americans was important for the war. US convinced their people that the war was a good idea with shameless publicity telling that the war was the best thing. They helped with money and credits to the war. It was called Liberty Bonds, the American biggest business. The US knew that they had everything to win. Literally, the German army was against the wall and finally they fell down. European allies signed the Treaty of Versailles, and Woodrow Wilson played an important role in this treaty. And yes, that's how the US became so rich by making their war industry created in the First World War.
Having into account the role of the United States as the lender of money to many European countries and becoming part of the sponsoring of the war, it was predictable that its economy was gonna be reactivated in the way that it happened. But nobody counted with the defaulting of the loans by especially Germany, triggering the economical rupture represented in the Great Depression. The second event to highlight was the Great Depression, the worst economic trouble that the American country passed, and it lasted 10 years. It is important to mention how this crisis meant in the future of the United States to go so deep that then it was the impulse they needed to be as powerful as we know it nowadays. First of all, it is important to explain why the dimension of this crisis is far from being exaggerated. Let's talk about the stock market crash. It was a phenomenon in New York Stock Exchange, in which people invested so much money that then they didn't have how to pay the investing to the banks. As a consequence, at least 5,000 banks went bankrupt and they had to close their doors, but not without losing before around $2.5 billion that were invested without their customers' permission in failed business. Later, unemployment decreased mercilessly alongside the capital investment and the gross national product. This can be clearly evidenced in the recognized movie Cinderella Man, that doesn't show only the social effect that the Great Depression had, but how people were trying to overcome the complexity of living in a country full of hopelessness. In this case, May faces the impotence of not having money to pay the energy service.
Who's that man in the house? Excuse me! Excuse me! Can I help you?
Sorry, lady, your pants too.
No, you can't. You can't. There's kids.
Why don't they let me go? They already let 2 guys go.
Please. This apartment. It's what we got left that keeps us hanging on.
Lady, I got kids too.
As you watch it, the anguish in her eyes, trying to highlight the need of the service for taking care of her children, and the cruelty of the state in order to protect its own benefits, without thinking about the humanity of each citizen. This economical issue triggered social consequences, such as the isolated sight of each citizen watching their country decaying slowly. But this panorama was part of the encouragement that American people had to rebuild their country with the leading of the President Franklin Roosevelt. The recovery process is going to be evidenced in the industrial advancement market by jazz music that had held the economy before the Great Depression crisis.
On the other hand, we may say that there was a kind of lag in the Great Depression, and this lag was one of the bases of the United States to be one of the most powerful countries in the world. This lag was focused on 2 aspects. The first one was the developing organized labor, and the second one was the Roosevelt's government. The last one is very important in the way that Roosevelt was the one who changed the course of the United States. The developing organized labor was one of the most important events in the United States, in the way that the captains of industry lost much of their political clout during 1930, and new laws appeared. Those laws make a great difference. So we can say that the time was a total split in labor in the way that traditionalist people decided to divide people who were considered to have great or special skills and people who didn't. And so that people who were considered to be able to work were the people who could work and tried to be able to survive. This way, in 1936, John Lewis, the operational leader of United Mine Workers, led a split from AFL, that was the American Federation of Labor, and made a new Congress. That Congress was called Congress of Industrial Organization. This Congress was more restrictive to people, and this Congress accepted all people who wanted to work. It means that women, people who didn't have skills, special skills, were able to work. The second aspect that actually was relevant in the U.S. history was Roosevelt's government. Firstly, because in 1932 he ruined Hoover. Hoover was another president of the United States, but he was believed like the one who had the fall of the Great Depression. Second, Roosevelt did something. In his first 100 days as president, he made a deal and he made it happen. Roosevelt and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, were very important in this process of changing in the way that they were friendly and approachable with the situation, and they knew how to compromise with the country, like Lincoln and Washington did. Roosevelt used to say, take a method and try it. If it fails, try another. But above all, do something. For him, it was very important do something for the country and go ahead of the situation. He knew that the situation was very hard to make a solution. However, Roosevelt made a decision that was create programs and tried to help United States. Finally, we must say that Roosevelt's deal actually helped to create 8 New Deal programs. Those programs not just allowed the United States to be one of the most important countries nowadays, but it allowed to United States to stop it being in a great difficult issue. It means the Great Depression. Those New Deal programs allowed to create new camps to give jobs for most of the people, to build roads, airports, schools, sewage system. It allowed create a new way to live for most of the people in America.
Finally, the first 3 decades of the 20th century in the United States brought multiple changes. According to Kurt Anderson in Fantasyland, it is worth noting the accelerated material progress, with cars, radio, and national electrification. Medical science advanced, universities prospered, and science and scientists were revenged. The rest of the world recognized that Americans were creating world-class literature, music, and art. No wonder, however, that there was some reaction against the march of progress. From the turn of the century and the 1920s, new spiritual fashion and crazy religious denominations emerged, along with aversion to the migratory hordes of Italians and Jews from Europe and African Americans from the South. All this mixture of cultures marked a before and an after in an American culture, since it achieved the integration of three different traditions: the Native American, the African, and the European. All this gave rise to the emergence of jazz. Geographically, jazz emerged in the state of Louisiana, specifically in the area of influence of New Orleans, birthplace of the musical style and the main jazz center during the early jazz era, where large consignments of colored slaves arrived, mainly for the western part of Africa, south of the Sahara, the area known as Ivory Coast, Gold Coast, or Slave Coast. In many areas of the southern United States, drums beating was forbidden by law, so black slaves had to use percussion with the palms of their hands and the beating for the feet to enjoy their parties and their characteristic music, for which the slaves used many of the African tradition with the Protestant Christianity imposed on them by their masters, which was the appropriate breeding ground for the development of the spiritual. The consequence was that they could keep a large part of their musical legacy intact at the time of marrying with the compatible elements of European and American music, resulting in a hybrid with remarkable African influence. The first style of jazz was called hot jazz. It was born from the street bands, formed mainly by trumpet, trombone, and clarinet as solist, accompanied by the rhythmic harmony of the banjo and the rhythm marked by the box, the babuola, an African drum similar to the timbal, and the tuba. When these bands stopped parading and settled in a fixed place, the drums were introduced, and then the double bass. The banjo was replaced by the piano. A clear reference for this kind of jazz can be seen in the movie The Great Gatsby, where, while J. Gatsby's house was having a crazy party, when was a colored man playing trumpet on the orchids of that place. Parallel to the New Orleans style, inspired by the blues tradition and interpreted by black musicians, the Dixieland style is developed as one of the most popular subgenres of jazz as the era of Depression approached, which also used elements of ragtime and faster beats, preferably interpreted by white musicians. Both styles were performed in the popular neighborhood known as Storyville, where prostitution is mixed with playing in place of amusement. This playful aspect will create a bad reputation for this type of music, considered by conservative elements of society an undesirable music. Because jazz emerged for unacceptable segments of society, it was considered dangerous and subversive even in the 1920s, when the popularity of jazz music literally exploded. The 1920s is when jazz emigrated to northern cultural centers such as New York and Chicago. And while jazz continued to be associated with wild and libertine lifestyles, it certainly defined the decade and changed everything about the culture of the time, from music to art and fashion. In the 1930s, jazz began to enter conventional music. The music industry could no longer ignore the importance of jazz because it was very popular, particularly among young people of campuses as US universities and high schools. Slowly but surely, the music industry introduced the seductive music of jazz to the older generations and also to the country's white populations. The impact of the Great Depression on music in the 1930s meant that jazz performers who could attract a wider audience would be those who would succeed or at least survive. The most common form of the genre was sweet jazz, as opposed to the hot jazz of the 1920s. Sweet jazz was more disciplined and brought other instruments, such as violins, to make it easier for a wider audience to appreciate. While this made jazz music that became popular with the entire population, jazz devotees and their performers such as Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and Jimmy Lucenford did not like it. The big band era, which dominated the music scene for the 1930s, incorporated jazz in a more enjoyable format, but did so by integrating other forms of popular music into their sets. Because big bands were able to offer the skills of dozens of jazz performers in a band, it was a great method for employing musicians with difficulties while giving the public even greater exposure to a wide variety of musical talents and styles. We can think of the 30s as the decade in which jazz became civilized, sophisticated, and popular throughout culture. The result was that jazz evolved to begin to merge with many musical forms. That evolution continues to this day, demonstrating the versatility of jazz music to adapt to the culture and reflect the point of view of the culture, also its listeners. Because jazz in the 1930s forced the format to grow, it also assured that jazz would change and grow continuously as the country grew. But it also assured that jazz would be a musical style that will continue to be part of American culture forever. As a conclusion, I can say jazz comes from its relationship with society, from the environment that poor, blacks, and non-blacks expressed as means of human expression at their disposal. Its condition of exploited, discriminated, marginalized was a point that gave us substance that contribute its social and artistic expressions. However, the elites adopt this gender without contribute in almost anything to its origin. That is why jazz won the war. They're going to being marginal music to being a genre of great importance to the world.